Hello, fabulous people! Welcome back. We are on chapter 10. Do you believe it? Time really flies, especially when you're enjoying economics as much as you are. Well, I'm glad to have you back. We're going to be exploring aggregate demand and supply. We're going to be exploring the classical versus the Keynesian view, what the aggregate supply curve really looks like, and talk about stagflation. And so our first point here is the aggregate demand curve. Okay, now this is Monument Valley. Who doesn't know Monument Valley? I love this place. If you haven't been, by all means, please go. Monument Valley feels like the world. That's why I kind of wanted to start with this image, because when you're there, you just feel like you are on another planet, and it is vast and complete and whole, and we are discussing big concepts today, so this makes sense. Okay. The word aggregate, if you remember up here, means total. There can only be one total, therefore there can only be one aggregate demand curve for every economy. The variables are the price level, right here, and the real GDP. And I have in parentheses that it's purchased because both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve converge on the same graph because they share the same exact variables. So down here, it will say the real GDP. The question is, which one? Well, it's the real GDP purchased, how much is being bought in the economy, because this is the aggregate demand curve. So price level, real GDP, inversely related, you have a downsloping curve. And this one is basically showing you the higher the price level in an economy, the less gets bought in total, and the lower the price level, the more is getting bought in total. Right now, we are seeing that inflation has been keeping people from actually purchasing as much as before, why we have a little bit of a fear of recession. Target just released their profits. They're down 90%. Why? Because the consumer is wary and concerned that inflation is an issue, and they're backing off some of the purchases that they consider peripheral or discretionary. So an aggregate demand curve is when the price level impacts the real GDP bought inversely. That's it. That's what we're dealing with here. Now, when we compare it to a demand curve has price instead of price level and has quantity demanded instead of the real GDP. And if you remember, quantity demanded is sales or purchases. So you're looking at a downsloping curve. You can never use the word demand, except when you start learning inelasticity of demand, and there are some exceptions. But for the most part, what you're dealing with is a downsloping curve that shows you that X, which is the price, impacts Y, which is the quantity demanded, inversely. So their variables is what clues you into whether you are dealing with aggregate demand or whether you are dealing with demand. Now, here they are side by side. Let me adjust this a little bit. Here we go. So when we compare them, notice they're both downsloping. They're both demand curves, only this one is the mother lode. This is the aggregate demand curve. Now, they don't have to be labeled. These could be labeled, like no label here, blank. You would still know this is the aggregate demand curve because the variables are price level and real GDP. This one could also not have been labeled. You would still know it's the demand curve because the variables are price and quantity. Kind of like, how do you know which one is George and how do you know which one is John? You know, from their faces. Their faces identify them, right? At minimum, that's how you know. And this is what we're dealing with is when we're looking at variables, we're kind of looking at their faces. What makes them recognizable is their variables. So side by side, you can tell. There are millions of demand curves in an economy. There's a single aggregate demand. When you lump all the demand curves in an economy, they end up right here under one called aggregate demand. Okay. Our next point is the aggregate supply curve. The word aggregate means total. So in this case, we are looking at all of the supply lumped together. The variables are identical to the variables to the aggregate demand curve. Remember, they share the same graph. Therefore, they're going to also share the variables. The difference is the relationship. So even though you're looking at the price level on X, well, this is Y, but it's actually X, but it's on Y. And down here on X, you have the real GDP. Well, the relationship is in this case direct, because what it's showing you is when the price level drops, so does the real GDP. So when we look at variables, we're looking at the price level and how it impacts the real GDP, and I have in parentheses produced, because it's a reminder that what you're dealing with is how much this economy is putting out in inventory, right? So this here is actually explaining to you that the short-run aggregate supply curve is responding to this deflation by a reduction in total output, because aggregate is total. This is just substitute the word aggregate and you'll be just fine. So what we're looking at here again is the price level impacting the real GDP that is produced, that the seller is responsible for directly. That's why you have an upsloping curve right here. Now it's important to compare the aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve to the supply curve. So since we went over the aggregate supply curve, it's really important to compare it to the supply curve, and then we're going to, we're going to put them side by side in a minute. Again, how do you recognize George or John? By their faces, by the variables. Price impacts quantity supplied, which also means inventory or output. So here's your price instead of the price level, because price level is all prices, and price is just the price of a single product or service. And down here you have the quantity, and of course in this case it's the quantity supplied. It doesn't have to say that. You know it's the quantity supplied because the relationship is once more direct. So the relationship doesn't cease, just the variables. And really all we're doing is we're kind of taking them down to like a skinny lane here, because it is for a single product or a single service. So this shows us that the price impacts the quantity directly, and you're able to see it. When the price drops from 16 to 12, the quantity drops from 55 to 40. When the price goes up from 16 to 22, the quantity increases because the seller responds to higher prices. The seller wants the higher prices because it implies that they can push the same product at a higher price, which may very well mean that they have more profits and they want to take advantage of the situation. Now, when we put them side by side, we can absolutely see that they represent the same relationship between X and Y, only one is on a more inclusive scale, that's the aggregate supply curve, and one is the opposite, right? It's a reduction. So here we go. Let's compare them again. Price level and how it impacts the real GDP that is produced in an entire nation, and you can tell that the relationship is rather direct. Down here is the supply curve instead of the aggregate supply curve. It's the price and how it impacts the quantity supplied, but they're both upsloping curve. Therefore they both impact, they have X impacting Y in the same exact way, which is really very logical. Now all this stuff is in your booklet, and of course I have created those videos that walk you through the actual drawing of each one, and they're very straightforward, they're very simple. By all means look at those, but this is just nice for now as we kind of go and give an overview of these concepts together. Okay guys, I'm going to stop this video right here, and I'm going to resume the next few points in the next section. That way I can keep these videos to around 10 minutes as much as I can. So I'll see you in video 2 in just a minute.